Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and my mission is to use this space to bring content to you that will help you understand your struggle with food and break free from binge eating. And today I want to have a look at the question, what constitutes a binge? Because sometimes, like, you might have had a difficult eating episode, or you feel like you ate too much, or you're stressed out about your eating. You don't really know whether it counts as a binge. It might feel like a binge, but if you have a problem with something like alcohol or gambling and you decide that you don't want to do those behaviours anymore, you can draw a really clear line between not doing those behaviours and doing those behaviours. And you know the moment you've stepped over the line, the moment you've taken a sip of alcohol, you've crossed the line. The moment you've placed a bet, you've crossed the line. Whereas with something like binge eating, it's more nuanced and there's an element of subjectivity, but there are certain criteria that need to be met for eating to be considered binge eating. And we use the word binge and binge eating in other contexts. Apart from food, we talk about binge watching TV, we talk about binge drinking. So generally, in kind of the informal, everyday sense, we're often talking about a lot in a short space of time. And so that is part of it. But again, there's this, how do we define what a lot is? And so there are some definitions that can help us make a bit of sense of it. And it kind of goes into two parts, really. There are two things that need to be in place for an eating episode to count as a binge. So the first one is that you've eaten a larger amount of food than most people would in a similar situation. Okay, so there's a circumstantial element to this. If you were on holiday and there was an amazing hotel buffet spread, most people would eat more than they normally would if they were at home on a Wednesday night. So we know that people tend to eat more on holiday. We know that most people tend to eat more when presented with a buffet and a lot of choice. So you could eat a lot, feel uncomfortable, feel regret, and all of that, even feel like you were out of control. But technically, according to the definition, it wouldn't count as a binge. And then on the other hand, if you were to go to a restaurant and have a big hearty meal and have some dessert, and then as soon as you left the restaurant you dash to the shop and you buy a chocolate bar and you eat the chocolate bar, most people don't do that after a meal out. So even though the amount of food in total at the restaurant pudding and chocolate bar scenario might be less than the hotel buffet scenario, the circumstances would suggest that the restaurant dessert chocolate bar one could come under being a binge, and the hotel one wouldn't. So that's one part. So this idea that it's more than most people would eat in a similar situation. What most people are doing, right? That's where the subjectivity comes into it, because how we judge or assume other people are behaving, particularly if we're struggling with disordered eating, may not be a very easy or accurate measurement to go by. And then the second part, which would constitute a binge, is that there needs to be a sense that you've lost control. So a sense that you couldn't stop or you had no choice. It's that compulsive element. And it's that bit, I think, that is the scariest part of binge eating, because it just feels like you're acting against your own will, like not being able to stop yourself when part of you knows like how awful you're going to feel later. Can be like a really scary inner conflict to be in. So it means then not only is it a larger amount of food, but the experience of eating the food needs to feel like there's a loss of control. So going back to the restaurant dessert grab a chocolate bar scenario, if it felt like a choice to get the chocolate bar, not a binge. It's all about that sense. So if you have like dinner, dessert, and then you feel this compulsion to get the chocolate bar, it doesn't feel like a choice, you feel like you've lost control, binge. If it feels like a choice, not a binge, if that makes sense. So another analogy that may be helpful and kind of highlight the subjectivity of this is, let's imagine that you had a box of 12 donuts. I think most people would say, like, if you ate all 12 donuts in one sitting, that sounds like a binge, right? But if it was a donut eating competition, there wouldn't be this loss of control. That would kind of be the agreement. It wouldn't be a binge. So also then, if we're talking, okay, a box of 12 donuts, for most people definitely sounds like an objectively large amount of food to eat in one go. But like, at what point, at what moment from starting to eat the donut, the first donut, to finishing the last one, did it become a binge? So for most people, having one donut, I think most people would say not a binge. 2 donuts? I think it kind of depends where you're coming from a little bit. I probably would guess that the majority of people, particularly people who don't have disordered eating, wouldn't say that 2 donuts is a binge. They might say it's a lot. I think they would say it was a binge. 3 donuts? 4? Like, where's the line? Maybe around kind of 3, 4, 5. People might kind of look at that and say, yep, that's more food than the average person would eat in one sitting. But even like if you say, okay, 4 donuts does that mean that 3 donuts and 3/4 isn't? Like, at what what point, this idea again that we can't draw this clear, bright line to know that we've crossed the line. It's much more nuanced and much more back and forth than that. But I think it's important to mention that for a lot of people, they may experience what they see as binging, but other people might look at what they ate and go, that's not a lot of food. So it wouldn't meet the first criteria for binge eating, that it's more food than most people would eat in a similar circumstance. So it's just the second part where you feel like you're out of control and you feel like you don't have a choice. And so to say to someone, well, that's not a binge, kind of, I think to me sounds a bit invalidating, because the experience is that it was. Like, it's a subjective binge. And actually our subjective experience is what is most important to us, because we're the ones experiencing it, right? So we have this definition of what a binge is, that it's, to recap, a larger amount of food than most people would eat in similar situations in a specified period of time. It can't be over the whole day. And secondly, that you feel like you've lost control. And the control part, for me, I think is one of the reasons why so much of the work I do is focused on creating a sense of choice, because that helps to manage the second part of that idea that we feel like we have a choice. And choice is so important to us, to feel free and to feel like we have autonomy over our lives. What happens is when you feel out of control, people panic and then they're like, I have to get full control back, and it's this swing from out of control to sort of over control. And like in the middle, I think, is choice and autonomy and freedom. So when it comes to trying to figure out if you've binged or not, you can use this criteria, but appreciate there's a lot of nuance in it. And actually it's just about, like, how do you feel around food? That to me is the most important thing. You know, I've worked with people that kind of on paper, their diets look like what we are supposed to be eating. And yet their experience of food is one of utter misery, anxiety, distress. And it's why the second part of binge eating, that loss of control, is more important even than what you eat. And people try to fix binge eating by focusing on eating less rather than focusing on finding freedom, you know, in how you think about food, how you talk to yourself about food. And so again, like, if you're trying to figure out if you've binged or not, if you think about this idea how we talk to ourselves, part of me wants to say, does it matter if it's technically a binge or not? Like, how are you feeling about it? That's going to be the informative part to say whether there's a problem here. And the problem may not be what you've eaten. The problem may be like what you're telling yourself about what you've eaten, what you're telling yourself about your body, or the impact of what you've eaten is going to have on your body. You know, those are the areas where I would suggest putting our attention. So if you want to call it a binge, call it a binge. If you don't want to call it a binge, like, don't call it a binge. But how you talk to yourself about how you're feeling and how you judge yourself for your eating, those are the places to put your attention first. Those are the places that are tripping you up. People want to jump to behavioural changes rather than stepping back and saying, what's leading me down to these behaviours that I don't like. So now you know what technically constitutes a binge. But I suppose my final words would just be like, whatever language you use, just finding a way to understand your experience so that you can make sense of it. We're always trying to make meaning out of what we're doing. That's what every opinion and judgment we have is. It's an attempt to make something mean something or make sense to us. And that's why I think language is important. But we get to choose what language we use based on whether it serves us or not. So on that note, I'll say goodbye. I'll see you in the next video.